If you told me a year ago that my life would end up circling a drain in the middle of West Texas, I probably would have laughed. Back then, I still believed in things like stability, future plans, and the illusion that if you kept your head down and worked hard, life would eventually reward you. Now I know better. Now I know life can strip you down to the studs without a second thought. My downfall didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. Sharp, direct hits that accumulated until I was too bruised to stand. First came the layoff. I'd been with the shipping company for 7 years, long enough to train half the warehouse, long enough to feel safe. But when the restructuring email rolled through, they called it efficiency. I called it the beginning of the end. Then came the divorce. God, the divorce. Maria always said I used silence like a weapon. I never understood what she meant until she threw my duffel bag on the lawn and told me she couldn't keep waiting for me to come alive. Turns out courtrooms don't reward the quiet type, either. She got the house, the furniture, the dog, and even the damn cast iron skillet we bought when we were still in love and thought cooking together would fix everything. All I walked away with was my truck, an aging trailer, and the sinking realization that I'd become one of those men you see at gas stations. Eyes sunken, clothes wrinkled, living proof that life doesn't discriminate when it decides to choose someone up. For a few months, I drifted from one dusty town to the next, picking up day work at construction sites and truck yards. Nothing stuck, nothing paid enough, nothing made me feel like anything more than a ghost moving through someone else's world. Then, on a Thursday night in a nameless roadside diner, I saw it. A faded classifieds newspaper left on the counter beneath someone's half-eaten slice of pecan pie. Help wanted, night bartender, the Last Light Saloon, West Texas desert, room and board included, serious inquiries only. The ad was printed in a typewriter font, as if the owner never bothered upgrading from whatever century he started the place in. No address, just coordinates. Coordinates that led straight into one of the driest, loneliest, most godforsaken stretches of desert in the state. Maybe it was the fried coffee I'd been drinking, maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the cold realization that I had no other leads. But in that moment, the idea of working the night shift in some forgotten saloon actually felt like a lifeline. I tore out the page, paid for my meal, and drove back to the trailer park where I'd been renting a gravel lot for $20 a night. By morning, I'd made my decision. The next day, I hit the road, towing my old trailer behind me. The desert swallowed the world in every direction. The farther I drove, the more it felt like the rest of civilization was dripping away behind me. No cars passed me, no trucks approached. Even the radio, local AM stations and static, faded until only silence remained, thick and uncomfortable. The landscape stretched out in a collage of sun-bleached bones. Rusted road signs, collapsed barns, abandoned gas pumps leaning sideways like gravestones. Every once in a while, I'd pass a burned-out vehicle left to rot on the shoulder, turned into a nest for whatever animals managed to survive out there. Everything looked scorched, half-dead, suspended in time. My trailer rattled behind me like an old man with a smoker's cough. And every mile marker I passed felt less like progress and more like a warning. You can still turn back. But I didn't. The asphalt eventually gave up and surrendered to cracked, uneven concrete. Then the concrete gave up too, and I found myself bouncing along a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance since before my parents were even born. The desert grew quiet, a suffocating quiet that pressed against the windows, muffling the sound of my engine. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the endless stretch of sand and the distant silhouette of a broken rail line that cut across the horizon like a scar. The coordinates led me deeper into nothing, past a ghost town with a single street lamp still flickering even though there was no power anywhere around for miles. I kept going. Hours passed. The sun finally bled into the horizon, turning the dunes into long, jagged shadows. And just when I started to wonder if the ad had been a joke, if I'd driven hundreds of miles on a wild goose chase, I saw it. A lone wooden sign sticking out of the earth, so old its paint had nearly peeled away. The Last Light Saloon, 2 miles. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, swallowed the lump in my throat, and drove on, toward the job that would change my life, and toward a truth I wasn't prepared for. But if I'd known then what waited for me inside that saloon, I might have kept driving until the road simply disappeared beneath me. By the time I finally saw the silhouette of the saloon, night had already eaten the desert. The building rose out of the dark like something left behind by a century that had long forgotten it. A crooked wooden structure with a sagging front porch and a flickering lantern swaying in the windless air. Except there was no wind, not even the smallest breeze to justify that lantern's unnerving rhythmic sway. My truck rolled to a stop, headlights catching the dust that hung suspended like old cigarette smoke. The sign above the door read "The Last Light Saloon" in weathered hand-painted letters. The wood was sun-cracked, battered by time, and yet the lantern, its glass dim and stained, glowed with just enough life to show me where the entrance was, as if it had been waiting. I stepped out of the truck. The silence was absolute. Even in the dead of night, deserts are supposed to make noise. Crickets, distant coyotes, the shift of sand in the wind. But here nothing stirred. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath and I was the only thing interrupting it. The boards on the porch groaned under my boots as I approached, and I was reaching for the handle when the door swung open on its own. A man stepped into view. Thin, tall, calm to the point of unnatural. Skin pale in a way I'd only seen on corpses at viewings. He wore an old-fashioned vest and button-down shirt, crisp white despite the dust everywhere else. His hair was neatly combed, the style a few decades outdated. His eyes were the only thing that seemed alive about him. Sharp, focused, and watching me as though he'd been standing behind that door for hours waiting for my arrival. "You must be Ethan Cole," he said, voice soft and even, as though reciting a fact rather than greeting me. "Yeah," I answered, my throat suddenly dry. "That's me. You must be Roy Buckner," he said with a small nod. "Owner and caretaker of the Last Light. I'm glad you made it before full dark." I frowned. Full dark? As opposed to what? But before I could ask, he stepped aside and gestured me in. The interior was worse and better than I expected. A long wooden bar stretched across the right wall, polished by decades of hands and elbows. Tables and stools were scattered across the room, all mismatched, all old. A grand mirror hung behind the bar, cracked near the corners as though something once struck it hard but didn't quite break it. The air smelled faintly of whiskey, dust, and something else, like burnt cedar soaked in rain. The strangest part was the lighting. The room was illuminated by lamps that should have flickered, should have sputtered, but instead glowed steady and warm. Too steady, too warm for bulbs that old. Everything had the heavy stillness of a place preserved in amber. Roy led me behind the bar. "It's quiet now," he said. "It opens only at night. They tend to come in after dusk." "They?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "You'll see," he said, as though the answer were obvious. "But before anything else," he slid a folded sheet of paper across the bar. "You need to know the rules." I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. The title at the top read, "Night Shift Protocols, for your own good." The list was short, but the longer I stared at it, the stranger it felt. Rule 1. A man in a red shirt and black cowboy hat drinks for free, but you do not speak to him. Rule 2. Never play blackjack with the one-armed cowboy. He's looking to win back something he lost. Rule 3. If a woman in a long dress asks for a ride home, tell her, "Wait for your date inside. He will come and take you home." Rule 4. If burning footprints appear in the dust outside, lock the doors. Do not investigate. Rule 5. When the jukebox starts on its own, leave it alone. Do not unplug it. Rule 6. If someone asks what year it is, lie. Tell them it's 1873 now. I looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Is this a joke?" I asked. Roy shook his head. "I don't joke about the dead." "Dead?" I laughed nervously. "So, this is some kind of ghost tour gimmick? A themed bar?" Roy's expression didn't move, didn't twitch, didn't change. "It's not a theme, Ethan," he said softly. "It's a crossing, a thin place. The living and the dead drink beneath the same lights here. The rules keep things balanced." You expect me to believe that? No, he said, but I expect you to follow them. Your life, and the peace of this place, depends on it. I stared at him, trying to figure out whether he was messing with me or actually insane. The desert wasn't exactly famous for its abundance of normal people, but this was pushing it. Roy must have noticed my skepticism because he tapped the paper again. You will follow every rule, he repeated, voice lower now. Without question, without hesitation, even if you don't understand it. I swallowed and nodded, not because I believed him, but because I needed the job and didn't want to start a fight with the one man who could offer me room and board. Satisfied, Roy turned toward the hallway behind the bar. You've had a long journey. The room at the end is yours. Rest now. You begin work tomorrow night. I hesitated. Don't you open tonight? His eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something like concern or warning. We never open on the night a new bartender arrives, he said. The desert watches new blood. Before I could ask what the hell that meant, he walked away, leaving me alone in the dim, quiet saloon with the rule sheet trembling faintly between my fingers. I told myself he was just eccentric, that the rules were some backwards tradition, maybe part of the bar's charm, that the desert was getting to my imagination, that everything would look normal in the morning. But as I turned toward the dark hallway, the floorboards creaked behind me just once, as though someone had taken a single step and then stopped. When I looked back, Roy was gone, the saloon entirely empty. The night technically passed without incident, but I wouldn't call it peaceful. I slept in shallow bursts, drifting in and out like someone bobbing on dark water. Every time I began to sink into real sleep, I jolted awake with the same cold certainty. Someone was watching me. Not something, someone. A presence with intent. A gaze pressed against my closed eyes like a fingertip. Each time I sat up, the bunkhouse was still. Moonlight spilled through the cracked blinds. The wooden floor creaked maddeningly, as if settling or shifting under footsteps I couldn't see. By dawn, my nerves felt frayed at the edges. I got dressed slowly, splashed water on my face, and tried to convince myself that last night had just been nerves. A new place, new routine. Desert silence playing tricks on me. I even laughed at myself a little, but it sounded fake. Most of the day slipped by quietly. Heat shimmered over the sand. Wind pushed dust against the saloon windows. I stocked bottles, wiped tables, swept the floor. Anything to keep busy and not think about last night. By late evening, the sky bruised purple, and the temperature dropped fast. I lit the oil lamps, unlocked the swinging doors, and stood behind the bar, fully expecting a dead shift. I mean, this place is in the middle of nowhere. You could walk in any direction for 30 minutes and not hit anything besides sand, rocks, and heat haze. So, when the door creaked open, I actually jumped. At first, I thought maybe it was the sheriff coming to check in. But instead, a ranch worker stepped through. A man I hadn't seen before, then a miner, another miner, and two more after that. They didn't look like modern ranch hands or modern miners. Their clothes were wrong, faded beyond reason, stitched by hand, dusty as if from travel but not from roads, more like from crossing time. Their boots left tracks on the wooden floor that looked pale and powdery, almost like ash from a long dead fire. They talked among themselves in an odd old-fashioned cadence. Their words had edges, like language that hadn't yet smoothed out into modern speech. Y'all hear about the strike-up in Stillwater Bluff? One asked. Bluff's been abandoned for 3 winters, another replied. Ain't nobody up there but coyotes. Stillwater Bluff. The name meant nothing to me, and judging by the way they said it, it probably hadn't been a real place for 100 years. If ever. They moved like people who'd done this 1,000 times. Sat at tables, ordered drinks. One laughed, but the sound was off, too hollow, like it didn't vibrate in the air the way a real laugh should. Then one of the miners shuffled up to the bar. He looked exhausted, not the kind from a long day, but the kind that sinks into your bones after a long life. He set a couple of coins on the counter. They were worn smooth, too smooth. Whiskey, he croaked. I poured it, he downed it. Then, he looked up at me with eyes that were far too bright for the rest of him. "What year is it, friend?" he asked. Just like that, casual, polite. The question hit me harder than it should have. I stared at him. A second too long, maybe two. He didn't blink. I forced a grin. Awkward, but it was all I had. Year? Oh, let's say 1873. I meant it as a joke. A harmless joke in an old-style saloon with old-style strangers. But the miner didn't laugh. He didn't chuckle, he didn't even smirk. He just nodded once. Slow, like someone confirming a fact they already knew. He said, "thought so." He pushed the empty glass toward me. Another. My hand shook a little as I poured it. The saloon felt suddenly colder. And as the night stretched on, I realized something that made my skin crawl. I hadn't heard a single car pull up outside. I hadn't seen headlights. I hadn't heard footsteps on gravel. The men were simply there, as if they had always been there, as if they came from somewhere I didn't have a name for, or from someone. I told myself I wasn't going to interrogate the customers. Roy had said nothing about avoiding questions, but the whole situation felt fragile. Like if I pushed too hard, everything might crumble into something I wasn't ready to face. But curiosity has teeth, and it gnawed at me until I opened my mouth. The ranch worker at the corner table nursed a beer and stared into the distance like he was watching a storm miles away. I walked over, pretending to check the lamp beside him, and asked casually, "Long day?" He huffed a humorless laugh. "Long year," he muttered. "What's been going on?" He leaned back, stretching his shoulders like someone whose bones hurt more than his muscles. "Same as always. Wages cut again. Boss says times are tight. Hell, whole territory's starving. Ain't much left after the panic." I frowned. "Panic?" He shot me a surprised look. "You been livin' under a rock, son? The whole country's falling apart. Mines closing, banks folding. Ain't safe to carry pay anymore. Not with the Galloway boys roaming around." He spoke the name with a tension that slid under my skin like a cold wire. "The who?" I asked. "Band of devils," he said quietly. "Men who ought to swing but don't. They ride the rails, cut down stage lines, rob banks, burn places looking for cash. Folks say they ain't natural. Bullets don't slow 'em. Fire don't take him." I laughed a little too loudly, because the alternative was admitting the hair on my arms was standing up. "Sounds like ghost stories." He didn't laugh back. "It ain't a story if you seen it," he said. "And I seen their horses leave fire in the sand. Burning footprints. Rule for flashed in my mind like neon. If burning footprints appear in the dust outside, lock the doors. Do not investigate." I swallowed hard. I drifted back behind the bar as more visitors trickled in. Ranch hands, miners, even a frail-looking woman in a bonnet who ordered tea she didn't drink. Their words painted a picture of a place that shouldn't exist anymore. A West Texas still crushed under some long-gone financial collapse. Rail lines still running, banks still vulnerable to outlaws, and a country so broken it seemed to sag under its own history. At first, I thought they were reenactors or locals with a theme night fetish. But their fear was real. Their exhaustion was real. The grime under their nails, the weathered leather at their belts, the way they watched the windows like expecting someone to burst through at any second. It all felt heavy and lived in. Then, without warning, the jukebox clicked. A sharp pop of electricity cut through the murmurs. The old machine lit up and began to play. A slow steel guitar twang draped itself over the room like a funeral banner. The tune sounded old. Older than the jukebox, older than country music as we know it. Something sorrowful and heavy. A melody that crawled under the ribs and stayed there. Rule 5. When the jukebox starts on its own, leave it alone. Do not unplug it. I froze. My hand hovered near the switch. Every story Roy told me that night he hired me came rushing back. That look in his eyes. The one that said the rules weren't jokes. So I stepped back. Slowly, hands raised like a man backing away from a wild animal. The visitors didn't react. They just kept drinking, murmuring to each other, sliding coins and bills across the tabletops. The bills, they caught my eye. They were old, browned. paper so brittle it looked like a breath could break it. Some printed with seals and signatures I didn't recognize. Some with denominations that hadn't existed in over a century. I leaned closer to examine one, laid neatly beside a half-finished beer. It looked like a $5 note from the 1800s. Real, worn from fingers that hadn't touched air in a very long time. I blinked for a single second, just a second, and they were gone. All of them. Every miner, every ranch hand. The woman with the tea, the brittle money, the half-finished drinks. The footsteps, the voices, the dust on the floor. Gone. As if the room had inhaled them all at once and swallowed them into the wood. The jukebox's mournful tune was the only thing left, echoing in the empty space like a dirge. I stood there gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't understand how they appeared, why they vanished, or why their drinks disappeared with them. But I did understand one thing. I wasn't alone tonight, and whatever these people were, they weren't normal. By the time the sun broke over the desert, the memories of the night felt like something scraped out of a fevered dream. Too soft around the edges, too absurd to be trusted, but too vivid to fully dismiss. I sat on the porch of the saloon, rubbing sleep out of my eyes and trying to drink instant coffee that tasted like someone had strained it through an old boot. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Not peaceful, airless, like the world was holding its breath. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, stress, loneliness. Maybe I had finally cracked, snapped clean down the middle like the last cheap plate I owned back in my trailer. But a part of me, the small part that had kept me alive through all those bruising months of divorce court, unemployment, and waking up not knowing what the hell I even was anymore. That part whispered that I hadn't imagined anything. The way those miners talked, the way their words slipped through time like they weren't anchored to this century, the way they vanished all at once, leaving the air colder than before. It felt real, terrifyingly real. Quitting wasn't an option, even if I wanted to. I had nowhere else to go. No money, no home, no life waiting for me somewhere else. If I walked away, I'd be walking right back into failure. And I was so tired of failing that the idea made me feel nauseous. So, when dusk bled into the sky again and the sand turned the color of rust, I took a deep breath, straightened my collar, and stepped behind the bar for another shift at the Last Light Saloon. For 2 full hours, nothing happened. No creaking chairs, no ghostly miners, no antique bills. No shifting silhouettes in the corners of my vision. Just silence so thick I could taste it. Then, the door just swung inward, slow and deliberate, as if pushed by a breath of wind too small for me to feel. And he walked in, the man from Rule 1, a red shirt the exact shade of drying blood, a black cowboy hat pulled low, boots coated in dust so fine it looked like ash. He moved with the steady, unhurried confidence of someone who'd survived more than he should have, and wasn't pressed for time anymore. He sat at the bar without saying a word, his presence absorbing every bit of warmth from the room. For a second, I forgot to breathe. I reached for a bottle, good whiskey, better than most travelers in this region could afford, and poured him a glass. The liquid glinted amber in the low light, steady, normal, utterly human. But as I slid the glass toward him, it went cold. Not cool, not chilled. Ice cold, as if the drink had passed through a glacier. Frost rimmed the bottom of the glass. My fingers ached from the sudden temperature drop. I stared at him. He hadn't moved. Still and silent, like a wax figure or a dried-out corpse propped up by some invisible hand. Rule 1. A man in a red shirt and black cowboy hat drinks for free, but you do not speak to him. My mouth, being the traitor it always is, opened anyway. Tough night out there? I asked, trying to sound casual. His head turned toward me. Not fluidly, not naturally. It pivoted slowly, creakingly, like old leather being forced to stretch after decades of disuse. That's when I saw his face. Skin dry and cracked like sun-baked earth. Wind-burned, aged beyond years, tugged tight over cheekbones that looked sharp enough to cut. Lips shriveled and darkened, and at the center of his forehead, a bullet hole neat, precise, Like a third, I punched straight through by something small, fast, and final. For a brief moment, something like recognition flickered in his hollow gaze, though I couldn't imagine from where. I was nothing to him, less than nothing. But in the silence that stretched between us, I felt a weight settle into the room. Something ancient, angry, and older than every regret I'd carried with me to that bar. He didn't answer my question. He didn't have to. He simply stood up, though his chair never made a sound, and began to walk away. But instead of heading to the still open door, he walked straight toward the wall beside it and passed through it. Not violently, not dramatically, just stepped forward and dissolved, like dust blown into a ray of sunlight. The only thing he left behind was a swirl of desert grit that rolled across the wooden floor before fading into nothing. I stood frozen behind the bar, fingers wrapped so tightly around the edge that the wood dug into my skin. The cold glass still sat where I left it, no longer frosted but sweating, as if whatever he was had left its frostbite inside the room. I didn't know what he was. I didn't know what any of them were, but I knew the rules weren't suggestions. They were survival, and I had just broken one. I must have stood there for a full minute, staring at the wall where the man in the red shirt had evaporated. My hands were shaking. My throat felt dry enough to crack. The saloon was silent again, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and my heartbeat pounding like a fist against my ribs. Then, someone spoke behind me. "You shouldn't have done that, Ethan." I spun so fast I nearly slipped. Roy Buckner was standing behind the bar, right beside me, hands folded neatly behind his back, posture relaxed, eyes pale and steady. I hadn't heard him enter. I hadn't heard the door. I hadn't even heard footsteps on the wood floor. It was as if he simply appeared, stitched into the fabric of the room between one blink and the next. "Jesus, Roy, you scared the hell out of me." My voice cracked embarrassingly. I didn't mean to break the rule. He was just sitting there and I panicked. "All right?" Roy didn't raise his voice. Roy never seemed to raise anything. Not tone, not heartbeat, not even eyebrows. His face remained perfectly calm, almost serene. But there was something under the surface I couldn't quite track, like the stillness of deep water that hid impossible things below. "It's fine," he said gently. "Nothing terrible has happened. Yet." The way he said yet made my stomach twist. Roy stepped a little closer, and I noticed he didn't cast much of a shadow. Just a faint blur under the harsh saloon lights, like his outline wasn't fully committed to existing here. "But Ethan, these rules aren't arbitrary. They aren't here to restrict you. They're here to keep you alive." "I get it," I whispered. "I get it. I'll follow them, I swear." "Good." A small smile pulled at one corner of his mouth, but it wasn't reassuring. It was sad, as if he'd seen this same mistake play out 100 times with 100 other people. Then, he tapped the bar twice with his knuckles. Soft, deliberate, and said, "Relax and continue your shift. Keep your wits about you." I turned to grab a glass, mostly to avoid looking him in the eye, but when I turned back, Roy was gone. Not walking out, not slipping into the back room. Just gone. Like he'd been an afterimage burnt into my vision and erased by a blink. A cold draft moved through the saloon then, stirring the dust near the floor. The overhead lights flickered once, like something electrical was passing through them. And that's when the door swung open. This time I heard it. A long, low creak. The sound of wood that hadn't been well-oiled in decades. 2 figures stepped inside. The first was a man in a scorched duster coat, his left sleeve pinned up where an arm should have been. His remaining hand gripped a worn deck of cards, the back stained dark like dried blood. His boots thudded heavily despite the fact that his footsteps made no sound against the floorboards. I didn't need to check the rules, I knew who he was. Rule 2. Never play blackjack with the one-armed cowboy. He's looking to win back something he lost. The cowboy tipped his hat at me, revealing a face carved with sun-faded scars. Eyes hollow, yet searching, hungry for someone dumb enough to take a seat across from him. I swallowed hard and stepped back from the bar. Behind him came a girl. She looked about 20, maybe younger, wearing a long dress that might have once been beautiful but now hung in tatters and trails. Fabric torn at the hem, stained with dust and something darker. Her hair was pinned up in an old-fashioned style, though strands had loosened like she'd been running, or maybe dragged. She moved quietly, gliding more than stepping, as if her feet weren't quite touching the ground. Rule 3. If a woman in a long dress asks for a ride home, tell her, "Wait for your date inside. He will come and take you home." Her eyes were the worst part. Glassy, unfocused, as if she were looking through me at something far behind, something I didn't want to imagine. The cowboy stood by the nearest table, shuffling his deck with one hand expertly, cards snapping into place like bones clicking in a socket. He stared at me with a smirk that might have been charming if his skin weren't stretched too tightly across his cheekbones. The girl drifted to the bar and sat on the stool closest to me. Her dress whispered as she moved, the sound dry and papery. "Good evening," she murmured, voice so soft it seemed to rise from the floor rather than her lips. I realized I had stopped breathing. This was no fever dream, no stress-induced hallucination. No exhaustion from a man who'd broken too many parts of his life to count. This was real. They were real. And the rules were the thin thread holding me between their world and the grave. I forced myself to exhale slowly, wipe the sweat from my palms, and steady my trembling voice. "What'll you have?" She smiled faintly, and the bar's overhead lights dimmed just a little. For the first time since arriving in the desert, I felt colder than the drink I'd poured for the man with the bullet hole in his head. The girl drifted toward me like someone walking through water. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. Her dress was the kind you only see in museums or Civil War reenactments. Long, tattered lace at the sleeves, a corset loosened just enough to suggest trouble. The lantern light caught in her hair, turning it into a soft copper halo. She smiled at me the way you smile at a dog you want to coax closer before you slip the leash on. "Well, aren't you a handsome one?" she purred, leaning across the counter so that the fabric of her dress brushed my wrist. "You could do me a little favor, couldn't you? Give me a ride home? It's such a long walk alone." My throat went dry. I forced myself to look at the wall behind her instead of her eyes. Sure. I mean, just wait for your date to show up. He'll take you home after. All right?" She wrinkled her nose like I'd served her spoiled milk. "My date?" She waved a hand dismissively. "He's dreadfully boring, talks about nothing, has no sense of humor. You're much more interesting." She slid a finger along the counter toward my hand. Just a whisper of touch, enough to make the hair on my arms snap to attention. "Come on," she said. "You're kind, you're brave, you're lonely." Her voice dipped. "Let me be the one you take home." I swallowed hard because every instinct, every stupid naive part of me wanted to say yes. Wanted to climb into a car with her, feel human for once, pretend the world outside this desert wasn't falling apart. But Roy's warning still rang behind my ribs. I forced myself to repeat it, my mantra, a rope to cling to. Just wait for your date," I murmured. "Please, he'll be here, then he'll take you home." She leaned even closer, lips brushing the air near my ear. "He's not coming," she breathed. "And even if he did, you'd still want me." Before I could respond, a voice behind her snapped like a whip. "Leave the boy be, Clara." The one-armed gambler stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. His hat shadowed half his face, but his one visible eye gleamed like a polished coin. His single sleeve hung empty and tied at the elbow. Clara rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh hush, Boone. You ruin everything. Rules are rules," the gambler said. "And this one," he pointed his chin at me, "is barely keeping his head above water as it is." She scoffed, but stepped away, melting into a chair by the window with an exaggerated sigh. Boone turned to me fully. "You look like a man in need of a hand of blackjack." I opened my mouth to decline, but the cards on the table lifted off the surface, rising and spinning with fluid precision. They shuffled themselves, bridging in the air with a sound like whispering sand. They arranged into neat stacks, waiting. The sight stole the air from my lungs. It was beautiful, terrifying, yes, but beautiful. Boone's voice softened, almost gentle. I can offer you something no one else here can. A chance for what you've lost. For what you threw away or had taken from you. Something twisted sharply in my chest. My old life, my stupid wasted potential. The things I had broken all by myself. What exactly do you mean? I whispered. Boone smiled. A smile that wasn't cruel, just tired. You know what I mean. The cards fluttered like a heartbeat. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit, play. Win back what's yours. I swear I felt myself move. My foot lifting slightly, the weight shifting in my hips, my breath shortening like I was stepping toward a cliff edge. Clara watched me with a smug, knowing smile. Go on, she teased. He's giving you a gift. My fingers trembled. I forced them to curl around the bar edge. No, I breathed. Boone tilted his head. No, I'm not playing, I said louder this time, though my voice shook. I'm not doing anything that breaks the rules. The gambler sighed, long and winded, like I disappointed him in a way he'd already expected. You'll regret refusing, son. Maybe, I said, but I'm still refusing. The room held still for a moment, silent, expectant, and then, softly, subtly, the bluish pre-dawn bled through the saloon windows. The sky outside lightened, painting the dust in a ghostly sheen. Clara stood, fading at the edges like smoke swept sideways. Boone tipped his hat. Sun's up. Looks like your luck held. And with that, both of them dissolved into the air, their shapes thinning, blurring, then scattering like ash on an invisible breeze. I stood behind the bar, gripping the counter so hard my knuckles ached. The cards fell, limp and lifeless, onto the table. The saloon was empty. I was alone, and the desert morning had never felt more menacing. By the time a month had passed, I should have been insane, should have been trembling in a hospital bed, or praying in a church, or screaming in the desert until coyotes dragged me away. But instead, I got used to it. The rules, the ghost, the creaking timbers, and the soft piano notes that came from keys no one touched. Even Roy's silent materializations. There's something terrifying about human adaptability. How even nightmares become routine if they repeat long enough. By my 4th week behind the bar, the rules didn't feel strange anymore. They felt like muscle memory, a quiet mantra humming under the noise of everything else. Late that evening, I arrived for another shift. The desert smelled dry and metallic, like a storm might roll in even though the sky was cloudless. I pushed open the saloon door, expecting the usual pale faces and soft murmurs of visitors who weren't quite alive. But the place was empty. Not ordinary empty, wrong empty. The air felt thick, as if someone had draped a heavy blanket over the entire building. The chandeliers swayed ever so slightly, though the air was still. Shadows clung to the corners like wet tar. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I busied myself behind the counter, wiping down a glass that didn't need wiping, polishing a section of wood already polished smooth by decades of ghostly elbows. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Still no regulars. Not Clara, not Boone, not the tired rancher, no one. A nervous itch crawled along the back of my neck. That's when I smelled it. A thick, sharp odor that cut through the dusty air like a serrated knife. Sulfur and something else. Something darker. Burnt hair and skin. My stomach tightened. That scent pulled at some primitive instinct in me. Something older than fear. I walked to the front window, rolling up on my toes like maybe if I moved quietly enough, whatever was out there wouldn't hear me breathe. The glass reflected my face. Pale, wide-eyed, before showing me the desert road outside. Burning marks. Big, ugly streaks of blackened earth that hadn't been there earlier. They glowed faintly, pulsing like dying embers. The shapes didn't form letters or symbols I could recognize. Just slashes, as if something had clawed the ground in frustration. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath fogged. The rules surfaced in my mind like hands gripping my shoulders. If you see burning marks outside, close the saloon immediately and do not go outside. My hands acted before my brain caught up. I shut the blinds, latched the windows, locked the door with trembling fingers. When I finally turned around, Roy was standing behind the bar. I didn't hear him enter. I didn't hear footsteps. He was simply there, like he'd grown out of the floorboards. He looked older, more drained. His normally solid form flickered at the edges, like a candle's flame in a draft. His eyes, usually sharp and calm, were dull, almost apologetic. "Roy," I breathed. What's going on? Are those?" He raised a hand gently. "Sit down, Ethan." I didn't question him. I sat on the stool opposite him, heart pounding. Roy rested both hands on the counter, exhaling slowly. "I suppose you've earned the truth," he said. A chill worked its way up my spine. "The truth about what?" He gave a soft, tired smile. "About us." He didn't need to explain the plural. I suddenly knew. "You mean?" My mouth felt like cotton. "You're a ghost." He nodded once. "And the others?" "Clara, Boone, all the strange customers." "Ghosts," Roy said simply. "All of us bound here, bound to this place." The room swayed for a moment. Not physically, but in the way your perception tilts when a truth rearranges your entire understanding of reality. "But I'm not. You're alive." Roy's voice was gentle, almost paternal. "For now." "What does that mean, for now? Why am I here?" Roy rested his elbows on the counter, leaning forward. This saloon was built over a crossroads, a very old one, a place where souls don't always move on the way they should. He tapped the wood. "And this bar, it's the tether, the anchor, the place that keeps the wandering ones from drifting off into nothing. Someone has to keep it running, has to keep them calm, has to keep order." His eyes met mine. "That someone, Ethan, is you." My heart hammered. No, there has to be some mistake. You chose me because I needed a second chance. Because I needed a job. Because I chose you, Roy interrupted softly. Because you're the first living soul in decades stubborn enough not to run. The words hit me like a fist. But why didn't the previous bartender keep doing it? What happened to him? Roy hesitated. Then he said, "In 1873, a gang rode in, a vicious lot. They robbed trains, banks, anything that crossed their path." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "They rode into this town, walked into this saloon, and shot everyone inside. Staff, patrons, men, women, children, every last one of us. I felt cold, colder than the desert could ever be. And that gang," Roy continued, "weren't just men. Not anymore. Too much blood on their hands, too much hate. They became something else, something hellbound." My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. "And now," I whispered. Roy's eyes flicked toward the shuttered window. "Now they want this place," he said. "They want the crossroads. They want the souls who linger here." He paused. "And tonight, they'll try again." A slow tremor ran through the floorboards. A vibration like distant thunder rolled across the desert. Roy's voice was steady, but there was fear beneath it. I don't remember sitting down. I don't remember breathing. After Roy told me the truth, that the gang was coming for the saloon, for the crossroads, for us, I just stood there behind the bar, staring into the shuttered windows like the desert might suddenly rip them open. Then the sound reached us. At first, it was faint, like a soft rhythmic tremor, as if the earth had a heartbeat. Hoofbeats. One horse at first, then 3. Then, God help me, dozens. 12 at least, maybe more. The kind of sound that makes your stomach sink, not because of the noise itself, but because of the weight of something ancient and hateful riding toward you. Roy inhaled sharply, like a man preparing to dive into freezing water. "They're here," he murmured. His voice had changed. It was colder, flatter, a voice used to death. "Ethan, listen to me." The hoofbeats grew louder, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. "You must hide. Now, in the storeroom. Don't look out. Don't speak. Don't breathe too loud." "Roy, I'm not leaving you two." He snapped around with unnatural speed and gripped my shoulder. His hand felt cold, but his grip was iron. "There is no victory tonight," he said, "only delaying the inevitable." The ground shook. The saloon walls creaked. Dust rained from the rafters. Roy's eyes bored into mine. "Go, hide now." A violent crash echoed from outside. The sound of hooves skidding across scorched dirt. A growl, not from an animal, but from something imitating one. Something wrong. I didn't argue again. I sprinted to the back, nearly slipping on the polished floor, and yanked open the storeroom door. I barely had time to pull it shut when, boom, the saloon's front doors exploded inward. The impact shook dust from every shelf around me. Glass bottles clinked loudly, threatening to fall. My heartbeat pounded in my throat. And then I heard them, the riders. They didn't speak like men. They snarled, bones grinding, flames crackling. I pressed my eye to the knothole in the storeroom door. At first, I saw only smoke. Thick, black, oily smoke twisting through the saloon like a living serpent. Then shapes emerged from it. Tall skeletal figures in tattered dusters and wide-brimmed hats. Their boots leaving burning trails on the wooden floor. Their eyes weren't eyes at all, but pits of fire, burning from deep within their skulls. Their spurs hissed against the floorboards as if dipped in molten metal. Roy faced them alone. He stood by the bar, shoulders squared, whispering something under his breath. His voice was low, rhythmic. An incantation, a prayer, or both. The leader of the riders stepped forward, boots smoking. His teeth were long, too long, and when he smiled, it stretched his face unnaturally. He said something I couldn't hear, but Roy's reply was clear. "You won't have them. Not this year." Then all hell broke loose. The bandits charged. Chairs flew across the room as if hurled by tornado winds. Bottles shattered one after another, glass exploding like shrapnel. Revolvers fired, deafening cracks that rattled my bones. Each bullet glowed white-hot, burning holes in the walls as if the wood were paper. Roy shouted words in a language I didn't know. Ghostly wind whipped around him, kicking up dust in spirals. A spectral barrier flickered in the air like rippling glass. One rider slammed into it and shattered into sparks, screeching, but reformed on the other side in a burst of flame. I crouched lower, palms over my ears. The heat, my God, the heat. The storeroom was turning into an oven. Sweat streamed down my cheeks, dripping into my collar. My shirt clung to me. My lungs burned with every breath, as if the air itself was scorched. Chairs splintered, windows cracked. The bar counter shook violently, as if giants were fighting on top of it. I heard Roy shout in agony. Then more gunshots, too fast, too many. Minutes passed, hours, or maybe each second stretched into something much longer, twisted by fear. Just when I thought I might pass out from the heat, silence. A dead, suffocating silence that felt wrong. Then, another sound, a slow, wet melting sound. I forced myself out of the storeroom. My legs trembled so violently I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. The air was thick with smoke and ash. The saloon looked like a bomb had gone off inside it. Chairs smashed, tables overturned, scorch marks crawling up the walls. And Roy was standing by the bar, or rather, what was left of him. His form flickered like a dying flame. Pieces of him were fading, drifting upward like ash caught in a breeze. His torso dissolved in wisps. His face was barely recognizable, melting into translucent mist. "Roy," I whispered, stepping toward him. He looked at me with mournful, tired eyes. "One last time. This place," he whispered, voice cracking like burning wood. "Need someone alive to keep the door open." More of him evaporated, turning into drifting silver threads. "Now the saloon is yours." His voice grew thinner. "Watch over the dead." His hand, flickering ghostly, reached toward me, but dissolved before it touched my shoulder. He was gone completely. The last whisper of his presence faded like smoke. The saloon fell quiet, grief-stricken, wounded, haunted, and I stood alone behind the bar, alive, but no longer simply a bartender, a guardian, bound to a place that refused to let the dead rest. When the sun finally broke over the desert horizon, the saloon looked like a battlefield. My boots crunched over broken glass as I moved through the wreckage. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't even panicked. Honestly, I felt eerily calm. Maybe the way soldiers feel the morning after a firefight, when the adrenaline is gone and only quiet resignation remains. I grabbed a broom and swept, not because it made sense, not because it would fix anything, but because it felt like what Roy would have done. With each push of the broom, I found myself whispering under my breath, like I was trying to talk myself into sanity. Just clean, just breathe. You're still here. The glass scraped against the wood. The broom bristles snagged on soaked patches where spectral fire had eaten into the planks. But I kept going, sweeping, stacking overturned stools, picking up shattered bottles with bare hands even when they cut me. The pain felt grounding, real, almost comforting. By noon, the saloon looked less like a war zone and more like a tired old bar again. Scarred, smoky, deeply wounded, but standing, alive in its own way. I sat behind the bar afterward, elbows on the counter, staring at my scraped knuckles and letting the weight of last night sink in. Roy was gone, and the place had chosen me. The thought should have terrified me. It should have sent me back to my truck, driving as far away as I could, all the way back to the normal world I'd barely survived in. But instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Real, tangible purpose. I didn't fit out there. Not in corporate spreadsheets. Not in the collapsing remains of my marriage. Not in the judgmental stares of people who couldn't decide whether I was a failure or a cautionary tale. But here, in this haunted little pocket of desert, among the dead and the damned, I mattered. I stood up, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and looked around the empty saloon. This is my place now, I said aloud. My voice didn't echo. The saloon didn't answer, but I could feel it listening. As dusk settled over the sand and the sun sank behind the rust-red mesas, a soft breeze whispered through the cracked windows. The desert cooled as quickly as it had burned, the temperature dropping fast. I lit the lamps, checked the bottles, reset the stools. I even straightened the list of rules Roy had left on the wall. It fluttered slightly as if someone brushed past it. And when I unlocked the front door, something inside me clicked, like sliding into the right puzzle piece after years of trying to fit into the wrong ones. I took my place behind the bar just as the first sliver of moon peeked over the horizon. Silence swallowed the desert, then a soft knock, not on the door, on the air itself, as if reality were tapping gently to get my attention. The lamps flickered, a thin mist curled across the threshold, and in that mist, shapes formed. Faces and silhouettes emerging from memory and moonlight. Old miners with soot-stained shirts, ranchers with ghostly dust on their boots, a woman in her long dress, looking around flirty before taking her usual seat, a man with a missing arm, shuffling cards that weren't entirely solid. They came just like before, except now they looked at me differently, not with suspicion, not with hunger, but with recognition, as though they understood Roy was gone, as though they knew they had a new keeper. I swallowed hard, feeling something warm bloom in my chest. "Welcome back," I said softly. A few nodded. One miner tipped his hat. The woman in the long dress almost smiled. The jukebox crackled to life, playing an old country tune that hadn't been recorded in any living decade. Low and mournful, familiar. I poured drinks, and their hands, cold, transparent, flickering, reached for them with gratitude. I belonged here, for the first time in years, for the first time maybe ever. I felt happy, because these souls needed me, and I needed them. The moon rose higher, casting silver light through the dusty windows. More visitors drifted in, each one as strange as the last. Lost souls, wanderers from forgotten years, shadows looking for a place to rest. And I welcomed them all. My shift had begun, my work continued. And somewhere out in the desert night, a distant faint echo of hoofbeats reminded me. The job wasn't easy. The danger wasn't over. The riders would come again one day, but until then, the Last Light Saloon was mine to keep, and I am ready to bear this burden.